Imagine a scenario where if you woke up in the morning and you saw a news broadcast that said, your government has decided that we're no longer going to allow people to do anything they want to do. We're now instituting all sorts of changes, and this is the way things are going to happen. And the reason this is happening is because we said so. Can that happen? Well, surprisingly, there's a lot of people who have no idea whether or not it could happen. And if it did happen, one kind of wonders, would people understand that something wrong happened? Or if they understand something wrong happened, would they know, do they have any rights to make sure that such a thing doesn't continue? Well, that's kind of where we are in the country today, is people believe they have certain rights, but have no idea why they actually have them. And if you ask them why they had them, and they've done this quite a few times on a lot of different talk shows, where or on talk shows. And so what happens is people will be asked questions about, how does our government work? People have no idea. And so it's kind of why we're taking a class like this. So let's go back some time, like really far back in time. The United States has been around for over 200 years, but in the beginning, things weren't always that great. When we got here, we colonized this land. Wasn't our land to begin with. There were people already here. We sometimes gloss over that fact. But over the years, as we've gotten more education and more understanding that certain things shouldn't have been done in certain ways, or we wouldn't be doing those certain circumstances in the future, at least we hope not, we start to realize, okay, all sorts of things happened back then. And so what we have to kind of do is kind of move forward to where we are today and kind of understand this is the way things are now and how can we make things best going forward. But back then we had a process called colonialism. And it's also another one of those terms that's kind of tied into all sorts of positives and negatives, depending on how you look at it. The United States was formed by a whole bunch of different countries, European countries for the most part, that all came here and were trying to take advantage of the natural resources, even some of the people who are actually here already. I mean, there was an indigenous population before all of the Europeans got here, but when the Europeans got here, they basically subjugated most of the people here, basically under them, or sadly enough, killed them. But what ended up happening is they ended up replacing those societies that were here already with new societies that kind of came from the European countries. And so over time, we've kind of evolved those systems that they created into what we have today. And so that's why we have all sorts of myriad of different kinds of, lifestyles and areas of understanding. Like you can go from state to state and see completely different philosophies on things because every one of those states got founded by some other area of Europe at the time, and over time they've kind of evolved into their own sort of thing. But back then, talking about in the 1600s, 1700s, 1600s, what they were doing is these countries needed more land, they needed more resources, so they were looking for new places, in order to get these resources, and the New World was discovered. So they came over here and started colonizing the areas, basically putting everything under their control and, waving their banner flag of whatever country they came from and basically claimed it for that particular country. Well, in the United States, the major influence, well, there were several major influences. There was the Spanish had come here at one point who were focused mostly on conquering and trying to find gold because they've been told there was gold in the hills, and so they kept looking for it all across the continent. There were the the Dutch, who actually came here for mercantilism, which is, the idea of making the most money off of, profit. Um, we had the English, who were more looking for religious freedom, which was kind of subjugated in the British monarchy. And then you also had the French, who were more looking for trade and creating, new places to find resources, like furs and stuff like that, so they could actually bring those products back to their countries, because basically at this time you're kind of running out of places to actually go and get this kind of stuff. So this new world, this new land, makes it possible for them to actually do it. So in the very beginning, a lot of the colonists that came here were basically all pretty much involved in trade. And so what they did is they would find the products here, or the resources here, gather them, sometimes create their own products based off of the resources here, or send the majority of the stuff back to the homeland. And this worked out in the very beginning, and then, like in the United States, or at least in the colonies that became the United States, there was an emphasis on starting to use some of the resources here in the colonies, and creating the products, and then sending the products that they created back to the homeland, and then charging kind of like the fees that they would have received had they actually made this stuff back in the homeland, if that makes sense. And so basically what happens is the monarchy realizes, hey, we're kind of losing out on some money here, and they're cutting out a middleman. And so, because they were the middleman and they weren't getting anything out of it, so basically they started creating all sorts of tariffs, which is a certain amount of money that you charge is like taxes in order for stuff to be imported and exported to other places. And so the colonists who were here were no longer being treated as citizens of the monarchy, but as subjects of the monarchy, and almost as if they were becoming not the colonists, but the subjugated masses in the areas that the colonists were taking over. So they weren't getting the resources and the benefits of coming to a new land that they received when they first came here. So that became part of the problem. So if you look at the way trade kind of fell into the problem. So taxation ends up becoming a much bigger issue, because the monarchy needs money, and the only resources they're getting from the people sending their stuff back is any type of taxation that they can add to it. And so the monarchy kept asking for more and more money, more taxation, and so we end up in a situation where monarchy probably asked for a little too much, and then demanded a little too much, and basically if you don't want to pay it, you don't have to pay it, except if the people who are demanding you pay it have a huge military and send that military into your territory, you end up paying it, or you fight against the military. Well, we kind of know how that turned out. So, but for the very beginning of the whole process, the colonists, at least the British colonists, were considered more British than American, if you think about it, as the way things were. But what ends up happening is they become more and more Americanized, and lose a lot of the abilities and benefits of being British. They start becoming less and less British, so you end up with a split down the middle, with basically loyalists who are still, proud of their British heritage, and a non-loyalist, so basically the colonists, who are basically for this idea that because they don't live there anymore in Great Britain, therefore they should have completely different sets of rights. So that's kind of where we end up around the time that we start to have serious problems between the two nations, or between the two territories, because one of them is still not yet a nation. So in 1774, we have what's called the First Continental Congress, which is, the idea is we're getting together and people who are here in the new territory, and we're saying, look, here's our problems. And so we think we can work these out because we're all British. We're happy to be British citizens, but we're being asked too much. And so therefore, here's our list of grievances. And they send it to the king, through envoys. And basically they were like, please give us these things in order to make sure, we don't have to, have problems. And so things like, let's lower some of the taxes, let's not tax everything, that sort of thing. And so they send off their demands, literally demands, with an agreement that they were going to meet again in Philadelphia in May of 1775. So about a year goes by and all sorts of things start happening, and taxes continue. Remember, you're also talking about a long lag time between sending a message from one side of the planet to the other. So, I mean, we didn't have instant internet back then, so information took a long time to get back and forth. So if somebody decides something, 6 months ago, and that information finally gets to you, you may be in a completely different place by the time you receive the response. That's kind of what happened. So on April 19th, 1775, remember, we're talking about May was when the new Continental Congress was going to meet. Basically, fighting breaks out. So it's the shot heard around the world. And so 8 colonial soldiers were killed at Lexington. And so we start with Lexington and Concord. And then basically the British decide to besiege Boston. And so this becomes the first real major conflict before war actually starts. So in May 1775, they have the Second Continental Congress like they declared they were going to have. But what happens is kind of like how all situations happen: when something horrific happens or some huge event happens, and then you have to make a decision immediately after. Usually the decision is kind of reactive rather than proactive. And that's kind of what happened. So in May 1775, during the Second Continental Congress, they literally found themselves with no recourse but war. So George Washington was selected as the commander of the new Continental Army, and basically he led kind of a ragtag group of people who slowly became a military, with a lot of help from the Prussians at the time, in order to get a stronger military. And then we had some support from the French, because the French hated the British, which kind of helps. But there was one last attempt in order to make peace. It was called the Olive Branch Petition. And so basically it was an idea of, come on, let's not do this, because it's not necessary. But you had a king who at that time just kind of went, I'm the king here, you're going to do what I say, and that's literally the way things are going to work. And remember, you have an entire civilization of people who are now living in a new land for, over 100 years now, that are basically have been out of British control for quite some time, very minimal control at that. And basically they're being told, you must do this. And so literally when the king rejects the Olive Branch Petition, you have no other recourse but for war. So on July 4th, 1776, we have what's called the Declaration of Independence. And so Thomas Jefferson writes this document, which is actually kind of borrowed from John Locke's The Two Treatises of Government. And so, I mean, if you read the two side by side, you'd say they almost sound like the same thing. So yeah, he stole a lot of his ideas, but at the same time, they were great ideas. So it wasn't like he was and he never didn't acknowledge the fact that it came where he got it from. So basically, this declaration, the Declaration of Independence, put the colonies at war with Great Britain, which was literally going to change everything. So now part of it is Europe is looking at it as these crazy people are trying to declare independence. No one can do that because the British government is so powerful. But the biggest problem the British government had is they literally had to travel all the way across what we call the pond. That's been used for a couple of different things, but across the Atlantic Ocean, and literally come to come to the colonies and fight this war. That's a long distance to go, and so not a very pleasant travel to have to take either, because these old wooden ships and the amount of time that you had to do that. Many times soldiers got here and they were already extremely sick when they got here. So anyway, so what happens is, we'll keep it to the ideas of governments. So the first government that the United States creates during this process, so towards the end of the war and basically the start of the new government, is a government that's under what's called the Articles of Confederation. It's kind of our first constitution, but it's not a constitution. It's basically the agreement of this is what your government is going to be. And it's a confederacy. And so what that means, because a lot of people don't understand what a confederacy means, it's a weak central government. So the states were basically a lot more powerful than the federal government itself. And so this works out because the states generally don't want a lot of federal control. But part of the problem you run into is you can't get anything done. Well, you can't get anything done federally. So if ever there was a need for like a war, or in order to put money into some big programs and stuff like that, which we end up having to do as we go, as this country gets bigger and bigger, you can't do it because the states literally have to agree on everything, and it just couldn't happen. So what they do is they eventually get to a point where we're going to fix the Articles of Confederation. And so it leads to this first kind of an amendment process, but the only amendment process they really have working for them is called a Continental Congress. And so they get the Congress together, and their solution is basically to destroy the government that you had, which was the Articles of Confederation, and they create a brand new government, which is now under the US Constitution. So that's literally what happens. So the fortunate thing we have going for us at the time is the people who were involved in the creation of this Constitution were some of the greatest thinkers of pretty much all time. And so we just got really, really lucky that they happened to be the ones there at the time. Now, there's all sorts of negatives you can kind of say about them, such as some were slave owners and stuff like that. But in the basic context of creating a government, these people did a really, really good job. Now, obviously, if they were working today, there'd be all sorts of other constraints and problems involved in the process, but for their time, they did a pretty strong job. And so the first real division comes out of your first US Constitution, that's between Federalists and Anti-Federalists. So Federalists are the ones who want a strong federal government, where your Anti-Federalists obviously would want a non-strong federal government. That makes sense. So at the very beginning, in order to sell the idea of the US Constitution, we have a set of papers that are created called the Federalist Papers. These are all kind of like published opinion articles by three of our major founders for the country. But these three people generally use other names like Publius and all these other different names that they use as their kind of their pseudonyms in order to sell the idea. So they didn't actually put their own names on it, although we knew who they were. I mean, we know who they were. So a couple of the big names on there were John Jay, Alexander Hamilton, and James Madison. And so these people were instrumental in selling the idea of why this needs to actually happen. So what they created was a federal system, a pretty strong federal system. And so one of the standpoints of this federal system is the final authority is the federal system, meaning that the states are no longer more powerful than the federal government. Now, we kind of have a lot of problems with that today, where there's a lot of state governments and people who don't like a particular federal government at any particular time, and therefore say the state should have more power, but that's not how the system was built. The system was built for a strong federal government. So at the very end, the supremacy clause basically says the federal government is the last authority. And so the way they did this to institute it is they created what's called the separation of powers, because you couldn't have just one of the major powers be more powerful than the other. And so we separated into three powers: the executive, the legislative, and the judicial. And so these three powers have their kind of equal but separate power structures in order to make sure that one always serves as a check and a balance against the other. And so it's basically a triangular checks and balance system. So, and there's all sorts of nuances, and we'll get into that as we go through the rest of the course on explaining that. And so we have these three different branches of government and the separation of powers, and basically they have checks and balances on each other to make sure that things are done the way they're supposed to do. Now, in order to create the Constitution, one of the first things that was done, because basically you couldn't sell the idea of this because it was still a powerful government. It wasn't saying, okay, well, what about the people? And the people who originated this document kind of forgot about that. And they may not have forgotten about it, but they kind of just put it off to the side, like, oh, that'll be taken care of. Well, Jefferson, one of his founding principles in creating this country, said, no, that's not going to happen. And so he designed what's called the Bill of Rights. That's the first 10 amendments to the Constitution. So before the Constitution could be approved and made law, it was decided that this Bill of Rights, which would guarantee all of the people the ability to, show that, the government is not all powerful, but has certain constraints and certain things that it's not allowed to do, to make sure that those are also part of the process. And so this was all designed through a constitutional convention, and that's how the Constitution was ratified. And so there's a couple of methods you can use to change our Constitution. The first one is actually another constitutional convention. So if we wanted to change our Constitution, basically we get everyone back together again, and we go to this big meeting, and then we decide what changes we want, and then we make the changes. So that's one way. And the other way is through the amendment process. And so historically, we've used the amendment process, and we've never used the Constitutional Convention process for our main U.S. Constitution. The only time we've ever used it before was during the Articles of Confederation, and the results of that were we basically dissolved the government and created a brand new one, which is why generally when people are saying we need a constitutional convention to change things, be very wary of that, because that means at the very end, if they do it, you're going to end up with a brand new government that may look like nothing like you had before. So it's just kind of one of those fears to keep in the back of your mind, which is a reason why they've probably never actually gone that route. There's been attempts to make one happen, but it's just never gone anywhere, because both sides of both parties have nothing to gain by basically losing everything. So there's a couple of other methods of amending the Constitution. which are not, they're less formal than anything else. One is social, cultural, and legal change. So basically, as things change over time, we start looking at different ways of doing things. So a couple of things like copyright law, which originates, over 100 years ago, slowly changes because, things that get added to the mix, like the internet, change certain things. So whereas copyright used to have to go for a certain amount of years because of the amount of time something stays in print. Well, with print out of the way and now the internet, with everything always available, these sorts of changes make it so when our court systems decide different cases, they're taking, this is the way things are happening now, as opposed to this is the way people thought it should be, if that makes sense. One of the other ways of amending the Constitution is through judicial interpretation, which is kind of a similar process, but it goes into the judges system to where they look at the issue and decide, is this the proper way it was supposed to meant to actually happen? And so it means ideals change over time, and so if they change over time, that may mean that our interpretations of specific things that were meant to mean this might actually mean this now. And so a lot of that change happens very slowly in this country, but when it happens, it's pretty obvious when it does happen. So those are some important things to kind of keep in mind for our Constitution. Our Constitution is really a strong, powerful document. And what's really unique about it, and I should kind of point this out, is not a lot of countries really had constitutions. So basically you had a monarch who was in charge, and basically had charge because that person had a bigger military than anybody else. And so we went away from that to where the people gave the power to the government, and that government is now responding to the way people actually want things to happen. And so that's what your Constitution is, to say, hey, look, there's an understanding the government can do this and the people can do that. And so as long as that understanding exists, it works out really well. Where it doesn't work, and this is what's important about that, and the point I wanted to make, is sometimes you'll have a constitution that exists for a government and the government never follows it. So if it's a constitution in name only, then therefore it doesn't really exist. So the important thing about a constitution is when it finally gets legally challenged, what happens after the challenge? Does it withstand, and does it show who's really in charge, who's powerful, and who really gets the last word? That's what your Constitution is.